And the other thing that I would like to see is more of a conversation around the factors that are actually preventing some children from succeeding at school. Children who come to school perhaps disadvantaged, if you like, there's a disproportionate number who are Māori or Pacific, but the idea that if we simply teach in this way, or if we include this cultural knowledge, or if we recognise this linguistic background or whatever, therefore will improve things for those children. It's not being particular enough. We're not going deep enough into what's really going on. Because my first question to that, of course, is, well, why do most Māori or Pacific children actually do very well?
Welcome to the Shape of Dialogue, Melissa. Thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, today I'm joined by Melissa Darby. Now, you are a literacy expert. Do you want to tell us more about yourself, what you studied and what you do?
So currently I work at the University of Waikato, based in Tauranga campus, working in their School of Education. And my research area is in children learning to read, working with families, promoting good habits in the home that can help children's early learning and hopefully set them up for success, throughout their schooling, but also beyond that, lifelong learning type situation. I got into it. Part of my PhD, I should say, was part of a Better Start National Science Challenge, which had a real focus on children doing well in those early years. So, yeah, we had an opportunity to be part of that, and then the rest, as they say, is history.
Right. And recently you wrote an article called Failing a Generation, What Literacy Is and Why It Matters. Mm-hmm. So for a start, what is it and why does it matter?
Well, to me, and there are multiple views on this, I started to see an increasing shift in the definition and understanding of what literacy is. And it came through into schools from a variety of avenues. But what the effect was, or the impact of it, was that schools started to expand the definition of literacy to include things like reading the environment, different cultural practices, perhaps reading like a carving in a meeting house. I think it was possibly well intentioned in that whoever sort of thought of these ideas started to or wanted to include different or acknowledge, I guess, different cultural practices, ways of storing and communicating information. But what I saw the impact of this as being is quite harmful. The notion that reading, for example, the environment or reading a carving, or in some cases, I read one instance where the suggestion was that dance was a form of literacy. The notion that that is the same as reading and writing, that skill, and obviously the ripple effect of doing reading and writing well across our lifespan, I found was quite reckless, to be honest, and so I started to speak out about it.
Right. Why do you think it's reckless?
When you look at the research around not only children who are able to read and write well at school, but then the impact of that across our lifespan, it's huge. So children who have those who are strong in those skills obviously do well at school, and people may go, oh, well, it's not just about academics, and it isn't just about that. Although I think that is important because of the opportunities those sorts of things afford us, post schooling. But people who are able to read and write well have access to a whole host of things across the lifespan, things like civic engagement, higher rates of community engagement, ability to help children with their homework, ability to apply for jobs and promotions, and good communication skills are really important. So even more recently, I've started to look at the literature on reading for pleasure. People who read for pleasure, and you're not going to do that if it's a chore and it's hard. So to read for pleasure, you need to sort of be good at reading. Those people have lower depressive symptoms, less likely to get early onset dementia, greater relaxation, greater empathy. It's really quite compelling, a whole host of things. So for me, I felt that if you're sort of denying inadvertently children access to those skills by saying, well, they're literate because they can read the environment, or they can read carvings, or they can do this dance, or they can, in one case, bridal henna was said to be a form of literacy. There's a risk that children will leave with the literacy box ticked, but actually have very poor reading and writing skills.
Right. There seems to be a growing trend in education to expand definitions of key things that we need to learn about. Yeah. Where's that coming from? I mean, what's the origins of these ideas?
I think a lot of it's coming from the sort of cultural relativism idea, I suppose, where, in an attempt to be more inclusive of different cultural viewpoints, different ways of knowing, as the terminology would be, we are trying to recognise that in things like school curricula, classrooms, and other areas too. But my primary focus is obviously in education. And while I understand that it's sort of well-intentioned and an attempt to be inclusive and recognise the value that different cultural groups may contribute to a classroom, I think we need to be really careful about conflating things that are actually quite different from one another, very different skills with very different applications, and very different impact on our life, with something that's actually thus simply not comparing apples with apples.
Yeah. There seem to be two things. There's core competencies like reading, writing, mathematics, those sort of things, and then cultural appreciation.
Yeah.
And so if you're Samoan, you might know about Samoan drumming. If you're Chinese, you might know about Chinese music. If you're European like myself, you know about classical music. And, I would consider myself literate in classical music or music in general, but in classical music in particular. But that's actually not going to help me to read and write, is it?
No. And the other thing too.
And sorry, and just one more thing. If I'm going to be better off if I can read and write and not know about classical music than the inverse.
Quite possibly. I'm not sure. I imagine so. So you'd have different...
you'll take whatever cultural, artifact we're talking about.
Yes, that's right. And also, the ability to read and write, it's key to accessing a host of sort of human rights across the lifespan. Human rights is an area I've studied and have some involvement with. It has a huge impact on things like health and well-being, lifelong learning, intergenerational learning and teaching for children, all sorts of things. So, we're sort of closing doors very quickly for children if we are suggesting because they are of this particular ethnic group, it's more appropriate for them to engage with this particular way of seeing the world or this particular cultural skill or practice. And that was another concern of mine, is that I felt that particular children would be disadvantaged with this line of thinking, where the idea would be, well, actually I've seen and I've written about this notion that reading and writing is a Western skill and therefore not appropriate for children who, for example, have Māori heritage, Samoan heritage, whatever it may be. That to me is, that's where my comments about it being reckless and just hugely damaging and so limiting for those children, along with others, came from.
Yeah, I mean, the claim that it's a Western thing is bizarre. I mean, I have seen Chinese and Japanese and Korean writing. It's multiple cultures.
Absolutely.
Read and write, and actually reading came from the Middle East, not from the Levant, not from Western Europe.
Yes, and that, people who sort of make these claims, I think, of almost painting children into a corner rather than, expanding their horizons, to me, show little understanding of human history and how civilizations have evolved. We evolve because we have evolved over time because we've seen what other groups do and go, oh, that's a good idea. I'm going to adopt that. And that's certainly what happened in New Zealand history and every other part of the world. Or we think, actually, the way we do it's better. I'll stick with what we're doing. It's through that exchange of ideas that we make progress. So the idea that we should kind of be boxed in by our heritage and therefore only stick to this, to me, is just, it's crazy. Knowledge doesn't belong to a particular ethnic group. It's should be shared.
It's and all knowledge is universal.
Yeah.
And I think we should point out that you have Māori heritage.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about that just briefly?
Yes, so my dad's Māori. I have a Māori grandmother, Pākehā grandfather, and my mum's Pākehā, and it's certainly been an interesting journey. It's possibly afforded me the opportunity to say things that other people otherwise can't. So I take that responsibility seriously, and therefore have spoken out on things because I see the damage that a lot of these narratives are doing to Māori potential. Other people's perceptions of Māori children. I obviously have a son who has Māori heritage as well, and I certainly don't want any teacher of his thinking, well, because he has Māori heritage, he shouldn't be reading and writing because, they read from some university academic that it's a form of colonization, I believe I've been told in the past. To say that would infuriate me is an understatement. So, I really wanted to, use a voice that I have in that space to try and challenge some of these notions because I see them as being really harmful.
So you talk about the people who are espousing these notions that reading and writing is Western and Māori kids essentially shouldn't be made to learn it. Are these serious people? I mean, are these people? There's a lot of madness in the world, and there's a lot, and thankfully most of the madness in the world we can ignore because they're not people holding positions of power or influence. But the people you're talking about espousing these ideas, are they people of consequence? Do they hold positions in education departments, all that sort of thing?
Yes, often. The notion of this concept I've written about as well called multiliteracies, even the pluralisation of the term literacy to me is problematic. It speaks to this sort of ever-expanding definition, including more and more things into this notion of literacy where, I've tried to argue that actually reading the environment isn't the same as reading a book. It's really what it is evidence of the semantic sort of flexibility of the term reading, right? That's all it is.
The other thing is reading the environment. What the hell does that mean?
Well, I guess it
could mean just about anything.
Well, it means that I look out the window and see clouds coming and think I better get my washing off the line. I mean, isn't that? I'm assuming that's what they're talking about. Reading the room,
But are people actually seriously making these claims that Māori children should learn to read the environment rather than reading and writing, or are they making a claim that they should do it additionally?
I think it depends. Certainly, I've heard from some that the concept of reading and writing is Western and it's a form of colonisation. Obviously, the written word arrived in New Zealand with missionaries in particular. So there's that association which, for some, they find it hard to disentangle the concept of or the skill of reading and writing, the technology, with the time at which it arrived in New Zealand and who brought it and all of those sorts of things. So they kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater.
And a 5-year-old's going to work all that out, right?
Well, ostensibly.
They know they've been colonised.
And of course, in doing that, they're ignoring actually the Māori history with literacy and what happened when the written word arrived in New Zealand. And I've written about this as well.
You tell us about that, because I was going to just say, great Māori figures like Sir Apirana Ngata. I'm sure he would be turning in his grave if he was hearing this.
I would imagine so.
So what is the history of Māori literacy?
Yeah, I actually went back and intentionally researched this because I was working with Māori children, bilingual Māori children, Te Reo Māori and English-speaking children, who were 4 years old, working with their families as well on how to set children up for success in reading and writing. And the families were fantastic. And somebody not involved in the study, but who was Māori, said to me, why are you doing that? Don't you know literacy isn't a Māori thing? And that became actually the sort of part of a title of a piece I wrote, because I was so gobsmacked and thought, oh my goodness, really? So I actually went back to prove that literacy is indeed a Māori thing. And what happened when the written word arrived in New Zealand was enormously swift and enthusiastic adoption of reading and writing, to the point that in many cases, obviously we had skilled orators in Māori culture because of the wholly oral nature of the society, right? But in many cases, the mana, if you like, shifted from those who were skilled orators to those who could read and write. People would exchange enormous pigs and other, prized sort of possessions for books. The more that Māori read, the more they wanted to read, and the reading ranged from, reading for political purposes through newspapers, particularly during the New Zealand Wars, and also right up into across to reading for pleasure and everything in between. Obviously, a lot of it was, well, at least initially, a lot was associated with translating the Bible into Māori. So I think people who see it as a sort of colonizing force find it difficult to disentangle that as well. But whatever the case may be, there's no denying and there are missionary register reports of this going back to London to comment on how quickly Māori moved from being a completely oral society to one that could read and write and had an orthography and so on of their own, a language that moved from being purely in spoken form to written form as well. And so I think that's a remarkable story to tell, and I wanted to shed more light on that and to ensure that Māori children now, if they enjoy reading and are good at reading, that in no way compromises their identity as Māori, and the notion that therefore they're engaging in some sort of colonizing act or something is just absurd, right? What they're doing is exactly what their forefathers and mothers, I suppose, did, is adopting a skill that will serve them well throughout their life. So I just wanted to I guess shout that from the rooftops to whoever would listen to me, and even those who wouldn't, I just kept shouting it.
What's your reaction? So are you a lone voice, or is there a growing group of people like yourself articulating these things?
I think.
And sorry, and is it against, what are you actually battling against? Is it just a few people, or is it sort of a wall of bureaucrats who've taken on this ideology?
Some bureaucrats, possibly more academics. I think we shouldn't underestimate the fear, I suppose, that comes from feeling like you're the only one who don't want to speak out in public spaces because of the implications of that. So I have a lot of people come up to me privately and say they agree with what I'm saying, and I'm very brave and courageous and all of those sorts of things, and I thank them very much. And but I mean, there's nothing brave or courageous about it, really. I think it's we're compelled to do these things because as academics and people in these positions, we have a responsibility, I think, to be truthful and to seek the truth somehow. And once I started hearing some of these stories, I thought, I can't not say something. There is a huge disconnect between Māori in kind of, for want of a better way of saying this, the average Māori on the street and Māori academics or in academia. And look, don't get me wrong, not everybody. And certainly a lot of non-Māori academics would agree with the literacy as colonization idea as well, and others wouldn't. It's not just a binary yes or no, but some of the rhetoric coming out of academia versus what people in the street think, they're just worlds apart. So when I've said to some Māori who aren't in academia, look, this is what people are saying, they're gobsmacked and as bewildered and angry as I have been. But I do think that we need to be careful about sort of the research and things that goes on in some spaces, filtering out into policy, influencing educational policy, influencing schools and so on, infiltrating classrooms. And it becomes a problem when you can't question some of that stuff for fear of being called, some sort of neo-colonizing force or something. Yeah, I'm not sure, but I've heard a few things.
So, has it seeped into the curriculum?
It has in parts, and again, I think, gosh, so many teachers do a wonderful job of teaching what is actually a hard skill to teach children. That's why I have a lot of my research is focused on the preschool, if you like, years, so that children are set up well for success before they even start at school. It isn't easy to. There are so many factors, I guess, that go into how children learn to read and write. But I think it had seeped in to a point that, we didn't have great reading and writing outcomes for a whole host of reasons in New Zealand, and the idea...
You mean in the past? Is that what you're
Yes,
saying?
and even now, so I think something needs to
Yeah.
change, and the idea that we were just going to kind of expand the definition of literacy, that to me was going to make it a lot worse. So that, because you can't just kind of shift the goalposts and say suddenly everyone's literate, because it's not that their reading and writing skills might have improved, it's that we've just changed what literacy means. So yeah, I think that I was concerned at the extent to which it had seeped in and could possibly go further, although I do want to acknowledge that so many schools do a wonderful job, and a lot of kids and teachers and so on are still focused very much on teaching kids how to read and write well.
So when you say it has to some extent, can you give us some examples?
Yeah, so the notion of multiliteracies I think is problematic. What that really is a focus on different ways of communicating information. So for example, I think it was the English parts of the English curriculum had said up until recently, and I'll also point out obviously that it's under review and having a refresh at the moment, but had said that literacy included talking and listening, reading and writing, and viewing and presenting. Now, to me, I think that's too simple and it seems sort of harmless on the surface, but really, if we tease that out, literacy, talking and listening absolutely grow reading and writing skills. So the better or the more children are exposed to high quality spoken language, particularly in the 0 to 5 age bracket, but obviously continuing on, the better set up they are to learn to read and write well. So I would argue that that's the foundation for reading and writing. Viewing and presenting are functions of reading and writing, and that we view, i.e. we read, or we present, i.e. we write, and perhaps we use our spoken language skills to do something similar as well. But the notion that all of those things, talking and listening or reading and writing viewing and presenting on their own, are not enough. Reading and writing, I think, needs to be the focus.
Yeah, they're auxiliaries to reading and writing.
Exactly. So the notion
they're not actually reading and writing.
They're not.
Yeah.
They're not. And so that's one example. We had other examples of multimodal sort of ways of communicating. So where the focus could be on videos or digital media, that sort of thing. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't include those things, but the age at which we include them for children and the extent to which we include them could severely impact on children's reading and writing abilities. Because, reading and writing are linked to a lot of other things too. Ability to think well, for example. So if you're writing a story on a computer and you're perhaps aged 7, that's too young. You should still be physically handwriting something, because the link between physically handwriting something and our writing skills and then our thinking skills is really quite compelling. So, my point is that I'm not saying it's an either or, but I think we need to keep the focus as much as we can on those two enormously important things of reading and writing.
Yeah. And so what you're saying, even in the current curriculum, there's a sort of a sort of fuzziness in the way that it's presented.
Yeah, there has been.
It needs to be spotlighted more.
Yes, and I think, for children, when the disparity that children already have in their reading and writing outcomes is quite large, and it compounds and gets worse as they go through schooling. They then start to not see themselves as good at it, and then they get worse at it because they don't want to practice and all those sorts of things. So, the focus, I think, as much as possible needs to be on growing those skills and giving children as many opportunities, particularly those who are already at risk, of not going, well, they viewed and presented that well, or they spoke and listened well, or they did that dance very well, or they read the environment very well,
But they can't read and write.
Yes, and that was what I kept saying was a huge risk with this expanding and sort of more fuzzy explanation of what literacy is.
Mm. just to drill down on how the manual process of pencil in hand actually affects our thinking, because I find that quite fascinating.
Yes, and I will put a big disclaimer out about this, that I'm not a writing expert at all. My focus has been more on reading, but having been part of some of the work with the new curriculum, I've been really quite amazed to learn about the act of physically handwriting something has huge bearing on our ability to think. So as we handwrite something, even myself, I remember studying for exams way back before computers are really much of a thing. If I sort of wrote notes out, it often commits things to memory more, not for everybody, but certainly for a large group of students. And as we write things, we often edit as we go. So we become, we're sort of thinking as we go and writing at the same time. And so you get that sort of reflection in the immediate time is that we're writing. The other thing too is that if we can handwrite well, and that we've been taught to form the letters and shape them and so on, we're able to then spend our energy on the act of writing whatever piece we're writing rather than physically drawing the letters. And the same can be said for reading, where if we are spending all our time decoding the words, then by the time we've worked out what the sentence says, we've lost its meaning because we've spent all this energy, right, on working out what it says. And we've gone, oh gosh, I forgot what the beginning part of the sentence said. So, the more that we practice these things, become more fluent, whether it's with our writing or our reading, the more that we're able to spend our time on comprehension and more sophisticated writing rather than on breaking down what the sentence says or drawing the letters. So
sort of you're getting above the technique itself.
Yes, to the actual act of creating something rather than physically writing or forming the letters. So I think that people tend to now think, well, what difference does handwriting make, because a lot of our work now is on computers, so it doesn't matter anymore, but it really does matter, especially in the early years of primary school. Having good handwriting skills is important.
Right. Yeah, I was actually going to ask you that later on, but are we going to need to learn to write?
Yeah,
and obviously we do. It's still really, really important.
Yes, I have looked into. I was sort of went to school long enough ago to have been taught cursive writing. First we would learn how to print, and then as we got through primary school, we'd learn how to link our letters and so on. There isn't, I believe, any advantage to learning how to, write in cursive style anymore. I like it; it's aesthetically pleasing, but the act of handwriting, is still really important. So making sure, for example, that children don't move too quickly to Chromebooks and other forms of, keyboard. Whatever the case may be, whatever the technology is important. Making sure, especially in those early middle years of primary school, they're still learning to handwrite well is important.
So actually keeping technology away from the kids is actually going to help them learn.
Yes. I mean, look, technology, it depends on how it's used and the extent to which it's used and for what purpose and so on. But certainly in this case, it's important for kids to learn how to handwrite. And I don't think people really perhaps realize that because of the digital world that we really now live in. We think, oh, well, it doesn't matter anymore. But actually, the research is pretty compelling, and it makes children often better readers as well. The link between reading and physically handwriting is strong. So, these things all have more impact than we perhaps give them credit for.
Yeah. What are the literacy rates in New Zealand? Are they getting better or are they declining?
Depends where you sort of collect the data at what year group and with what group of children and so on. But when I was first starting my PhD, one of the statistics was that by the end of the first year of primary school, which is where I've mostly worked, 1 in 3 children weren't meeting the standard at the time for reading and 1 in 4 for writing. PISA data that's collected with 15-year-olds shows that for similar sort of outcomes, that would obviously be better or worse depending on, what schools we're looking at, different groups of children. But that's why I started to shift my work to preschool children, because by the time children at the end of first year of primary school are perhaps falling behind, while they may improve, it's very difficult for them to catch up because their learning has to accelerate, rather than just simply improve. And other things start to kick in. They start to not see themselves as readers or writers. If they don't have the skill to access not only the reading or writing tasks that they may be set, but increasingly maths tasks. As they get through primary school, they need to read a lot of the maths problems. They need to read science books. They need to read, a lot of things. So it's not just...
So it actually turns out that reading can be quite useful.
It is quite useful, believe it.
Right.
Who knew?
Yeah, who would have thought?
Who would have thought? So it's not, I've argued as well, it's not just a skill in and of itself, but obviously something it's sort of like a tool that we use not only to access other parts of the curriculum while we're at school, but also right across our lifespan. Not just about reading books, but we read maps and text messages and voting papers and all sorts. So once children sort of fall behind in these skills, it's very hard for them to catch up. And of course, then if they can't access other parts of the curriculum, they may be bored, they disengage. They often, I'm not saying this happens in every case, it seems a bit fatalistic, but they often, perhaps misbehave in the classroom. And you can see this snowball effect of, if you can't engage in something, it's very hard to sit still for the day, and they often perhaps are stood down or excluded from the classroom. There's a lot of there's a huge ripple effect of children not being able to do these things well.
And going back to our academic friends who are espousing all this sort of broadening of the term literacy, would they say that if a child is not engaging, it's because the education is not fitted to their cultural milieu?
Often.
Is that what they're saying?
Often.
Yeah.
Often. And of course, that assumes a whole host of things of, the conflation of culture and ethnicity. Just because you have a particular ethnic background, it doesn't always align to a particular cultural background. It fails to recognise that actually the students who do the best in New Zealand, who outperform the dominant culture, as the terminology goes, aren't from the dominant culture.
So Asians, students.
That's a fly in the ointment, and it needs to be addressed if we're going to go down that path of, sort of culturally appropriate education being the key to success. I'm not saying it isn't a factor, but it's sort of presented as the silver bullet in many instances. I think as well it ignores the fact that many Māori children or Pacific children do very well at school. So how is that the case?
Right.
I also think that the notion, we've got it round the wrong way. I think that students, the sort of argument is that students need to enjoy what they're doing and classrooms need to be fun and entertaining, and then they'll learn. But through being in so many classrooms and talking with a lot of children, and even my own son, children enjoy being able to do something, and then they want to do it more and more and more. So I think it's actually the other way around, that if they get that satisfaction of accomplishing something and, gaining a new skill, they then want to do it more. So a lot of teachers have said to me, we almost feel like we're sort of meant to just entertain children. And you see that a lot. I see it even at university. They won't want to do that. It's not fun. And I think, oh my goodness, the things I had to sit through when I was a child in the 80s. They weren't interested in making it fun then.
All learning requires technique, or to achieve something, you first have to gain a technique, and then you can be creative and have fun.
Yeah.
I'm a musician. There's no fun if you can't play anything.
Yes.
And it takes a lot of skill, a lot of, grit and determination to gain the technique. And it's no different in any other skill.
I agree. And actually my son learns the piano and he's learned other instruments, and he said to me recently he's thrilled because he's sort of got through the boring bits of the piano and now he can finally start to play music that he likes rather than doing all the sort of drills and whatever else. I'm not a musician, unfortunately, but certainly appreciate music, but don't play anything. And he, he's done the hard yards of getting those foundations, and now finally he can have a bit of fun with it. So, yeah, I do think that we underestimate how much joy and pleasure children get out of being able to do something. And I see it with children, even with maths. I was actually at a school recently where kids were doing extra maths problems in their own time at lunchtime because they loved so much that feeling of being able to do something, having mastered something. And even as an adult, it's still pretty thrilling.
Now, what's structured literacy?
That's a really good question. So it's a broad. It depends who you ask, for starters. So it's more of a focus on the phonics aspects of letter sound correspondences.
So just explain what phonics is.
So basically knowing that this particular letter makes this particular sound. So it has more of a focus on that than, for example, what we previously had, which was looking at whole language or balanced literacy. And again, people have...
Which means looking at a whole word.
Yes, looking at a whole word and looking at cues in the text and thinking, well, based on the sort of semantics and the picture perhaps and other things, I think the word must be this. We did have that approach in many cases for a long time. The move now to structured literacy, there'll be some who think that it must be like this for it to be purely structured literacy. So it is a bit of a spectrum. I just want to acknowledge that there isn't this sort of single definition, if you like, but certainly...
But essentially what...
Yeah, it has the focus on phonics, the letter sound correspondences. It's taught in a very systematic way so that you sort of build on children's knowledge and skill. So hopefully that alleviates any issues with cognitive load, which is essentially where there's just too much for children to cope with and their brain starts to go, oh my goodness, what? So that's, I guess, aspects of it in a nutshell. And there's different providers who perhaps would add other things to that as well. But the shift has been more on the decoding, in other words, sounding out a word and having those skills alongside obviously comprehension. Just because you can decode a word doesn't mean you know what it means. I could probably read an entire medical textbook and know very little what it means, but I could hopefully decode most of the words or have a good go at it at least. So we've got a move to that now, and it's had remarkable success for many children. I believe it.
And you're talking worldwide.
Yes, and in New Zealand as well. Some of the data that came out from Better Start literacy approach. My PhD was part of that National Science Challenge, and it has now moved into schools, many schools around the country, and they've had some really successful studies that have shown that children have really improved in those foundational skills, being able to sound out a word well and therefore apply that knowledge or that understanding of what sound each letter makes to different words. You can therefore encounter another word and, combined with vocabulary knowledge and other factors in the mix, you can have a good chance of not only reading it, but understanding what you're reading. So it has had a lot of success. There are certainly others who are a little more skeptical. I never like anything that's really presented as a silver bullet because there are other factors in the mix. I don't think we pay enough attention to children's home environment and the enormous difference that parents can make, caregivers can make, even just with very simple, just talking to your child. Doesn't have to be turning the home into a school or anything, but I think I'd love to see more encouragement and support for families to grow their children's literacy skills, especially in those early years.
Yeah, someone said to me once that, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but I'll say it. They said all education comes from the home.
Yeah.
What are you thinking on that?
I think it's probably like not all, but definitely more than we think. So I've worked with hundreds of families up and down the country across lots of different ethnic backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, and you know, the parents often say to me one of two things: either I'm not a teacher, therefore what difference can I possibly make for my child's learning? It's not something I'm, equipped to do. And my gosh, my first thing to them is that you can do so much. You don't need to go and get an entire, primary or early childhood degree to do this. Simple ways that you converse with your children, read with your children, point out different things around you, songs that you might sing with your children can make such a huge difference. More concerningly, some families have said to me, look, that's not actually my job. That's what I send them to preschool or kindergarten or, primary school and so on for. And I guess I just encourage families to that the small little things they can do in their everyday life can actually make a difference if they choose to. If they don't, well, that's fine. But I would love to see more of a focus in that area because, a lot of the research says as well that if we, schools and home environments are kind of on the same page, then that's really helpful for children. Plus, things like, one of the reasons that I never like things being presented as a silver bullet, and then it would include structured literacy, is that things like attitudes to reading, family experiences with reading role models, particularly in the home, beliefs about reading, how much reading is valued, all of those things actually correlate to children's reading outcomes. So structured literacy is good, and it's got some good data behind it, but there are other factors too.
Yeah. How parents value education itself must be incredibly important.
Yes, it is incredibly important. And not only, education, learning, if they sort of stimulate a curiosity, in the world around them for their children, all of those things go a long way. So that's why I'd love to see just a bit more of a focus with families, not to turn the home into a school, as I said, but to do those little things that can make a world of difference for children. If children see their parents reading or somebody in their home, it may be an older sibling or it may be a grandparent, whoever, it becomes normal for them.
Yeah, role models, essentially.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So I imagine reading rates are actually going down across all the entire population.
Yes.
And is that going down at an alarming rate, or
at an alarming rate? Yes.
Yeah. So that's going to make teaching kids reading harder because they won't be having the role models.
Yes, and also, I mean, now children have access to so many other forms of entertainment that I was actually just speaking with somebody the other day. We were laughing that you sort of had maybe a couple of hours after school of children's programs, and then it moved into adults programming, and then maybe a couple of hours on a weekend, and that was it. But now children have access on multiple devices to any movie or children's program they want, and of course
infinity, basically.
It's just endless. Games, a whole host of things in that space that we simply or previous generations didn't have. So reading, I guess, was more of an option for us. Now children, fewer children read for pleasure. Actually, very few children read for pleasure, and that's a problem as well, because the more you sort of practice your reading, the better at it you'll get. And you're never going to get better at it if you don't practice, and it's never going to be pleasant or pleasurable if you don't practice, so it all sort of feeds into one another.
Yeah. So, technology, for all its wonders, it seems to be doing having some dramatic effects, negative effects on us. And going forward as a society, if you're talking about the correlation between your literacy rate and your overall well-being, whether it's economic or health and social and all that sort of thing, are we going to have problems as a result in years to come, do you think?
Well, I would prefer I'd feel better if literacy rates, improved in terms of avoiding some of the issues. Certainly, actually, I often present this, some of these statistics around the predictive nature of a lot of skills associated with reading. So, for example, children's vocabulary knowledge on school entry is correlated with, X percentage. I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it's 30% higher, salary aged 30. Children's phonological awareness, that's their ability to hear the sounds and words and so on, age 10 is, correlated with, or it's a predictive factor in terms of their ability to get out of poverty if they find themselves in that as a child. It's huge. So it's not just about, parents often say to me, oh, my little Johnny or whatever isn't a reader. He or she, if girl, prefers to climb trees or play sport or whatever. And I accept that, those things are fun for children as well, but it's not just about enjoying books. It is that, but it's also about the huge ripple effect into other areas of our lives that being able to read and write well has. I mentioned earlier, the less likely to have sort of early onset dementia, so it's got health implications. This is reading for pleasure in particular. Greater empathy. So what role does reading play, for example, in creating or at least fostering some degree of social cohesion? Because, you can read about different children from different backgrounds or families or the story from somewhere else that maybe makes you, certainly the research tells us, more empathetic or aware of other cultural backgrounds, other viewpoints, a bit more open-minded. So I think we underestimate just how wide-reaching this thing is. That's why it concerns me to see that it could become anything, anything and everything.
Yeah, well, yes. Well, I was literally going to touch on that topic again. What we're talking about at the beginning. So you have this technological attack, in a sense, on literacy rates, but then you have this philosophical attack by people who consider it, not culturally appropriate. So, and what concerns me most is these attacks are not going to affect the children growing up in leafy suburbs in Remuera and all the posh suburbs. They're going to affect the kids in Otara, which the technological thing is going to be affecting them substantially, I imagine, because I imagine a lot of people use technology as a babysitter. So the kids are going to be spending more and more time in front of a screen. But then if you're also told that it's not culturally appropriate to teach kids, it's a real negative compounding effect, which is, just one of many. So it's very disturbing.
It is disturbing, and that's why I've spoken out as much as I can, because I see the children who are most at risk from these ideas, like you say, aren't the children who are growing up in homes where the parents are often highly educated, perhaps readers themselves, where they have access to tutoring should they fall behind in their reading or writing, but rather the children who rely on education to as the sole sort of tool to get them out of whatever circumstances they've been born into. It's cosmic luck, isn't it, who we're born to? So, if we're sort of in a home where reading isn't a feature, where education is valued very little, or where parents simply don't know what they don't know and aren't passing those messages on to their children, then kids are really relying on teachers and a good education system to give them those skills so that they can compete with the kids from the leafy suburbs, so that they can have doors open to them that would otherwise perhaps remain closed. And I see literacy as being a really crucial key, and it's not the only one, but certainly a big one, in opening those doors. So to me, the people who are promoting these ideas that it's somehow harmful to teach children to read and write well, and that it's should be reserved for people from a particular cultural or ethnic background, is just unbelievable. And the irony, of course, is that most of these people have PhDs, so they've certainly had enough of a high enough degree of literacy to acquire a PhD.
So they're quite happy to pull the drawbridge up after them.
That's what it feels like. So I just find it quite just unbelievable, really. So I've just done my best to at least hold the conversation. Look, I'm happy to be proven wrong on it, but at least let's discuss this and look at some of the unintended consequences of pushing these ideas.
Now, you've talked about, I think you just mentioned, you used the term speaking up. Earlier you talked about colleagues saying, I completely agree with you and it's great that you're saying this, but I would never say it in public. It fascinates me why people don't say anything. They think one thing and will either do nothing or say something completely different. And they often won't support people who actually say something and they agree with. So can you explain that phenomenon, if you can? And also what makes you so special?
Oh gosh, no. Well, I
didn't quite mean it like that, but I mean, you don't seem to have any problem saying what you think.
Well, I think, in response to your first question, I think, cancel culture is unfortunately, it's a real thing and on the rise. And I've had a couple of people say, look, I would support you publicly, but I'm on a fixed term contract, for example, so they don't want to have their contract not renewed, from saying something apparently, unpalatable or whatever, I'm not sure.
I use the term heretical.
Heretical. We have our, neo sort of religious elements to a lot of this. And I understand that, people have they need to make a living, they have mortgages to pay and families to care for and so on. And I get that. I did think to myself and have thought to myself over time, there's, a fine line between bravery and stupidity. And I come close to crossing that line sometimes. But I also think, I'm not going to be bullied. If I think something, I'm going to say it tactfully from diplomatically in a way that is addressing the point and not ever criticizing or attacking a person, but rather putting forward an idea. And certainly in some cases I've been able to say things because I have Māori heritage that other people, can't. So I can't be dismissed as kind of, racist white person, which they've certainly tried in some cases, but not. It's not as easy, I guess. So I do have that. But I think, for me, on a personal level, I couldn't live with myself if these narratives got out there and harmed those children, like I say, who are relying on a good education to open doors to them that otherwise simply wouldn't be opened. So I sort of think of them, and if it means I get fired out and labelled a heretic or whatever, then look, at least I can sleep straight in my bed at night.
The other thing about going back to you're talking about these people with PhDs, espousing that Māori kids shouldn't learn to read, is they're doing it they'll be issuing these tweets or whatever, these documents or writing on a computer.
Yeah.
They'll be driving on a road, driving in a car, wearing Western clothes. The whole environment.
Very selective.
It's why don't we decolonize absolutely everything then, and have no roads and have no food, no McDonald's and all those sorts of things. I mean, I'd be with them if they went against McDonald's and KFC. I'd be right out there supporting them. But the West has brought a lot of terrible things like that into the country.
Yeah.
But that's what I think's ironic, because they're sort of going after things that are really beneficial to people.
They are. And look, there are certainly a lot of people who would advocate for an and approach, but even I see some risk in that where, my issue isn't with any inclusion of cultural knowledge, it's the sort of conflation of the two. It's great to look at different, people's backgrounds and so on, that's all well and good, but the idea that reading and writing is the same and interchangeable as something like, reading the environment or reading a carving or performing a cultural dance or so on. It simply isn't in any context, and that actually goes the other way around as well, that in particular contexts, it's the cultural knowledge that you want, right? Because that's the tool that makes the most sense somewhere, and reading and writing perhaps isn't the most relevant thing. But yeah, so for me it's about the increasing and ever increasing, I should say, and shifting definition of literacy that I see is very concerning. And of course the idea that if you are good at reading and writing, you've somehow compromised your identity is particularly Māori. It seems to affect Māori most of all, but possibly other ethnic groups as well.
Yeah. Well, I taught music for 40 years, and I know how hard it is to get some information from one brain to another. And the idea of having to, add a whole plethora of other things to the process is actually just ridiculous. It's never going to work.
No.
And it'll come at great cost because you can't do everything. Life is short. You've only got a certain amount of resource and a certain amount of time. Mm-hmm. And also, especially for the kids who are most disadvantaged, they're not necessarily going to be the fastest learners. So you have to narrow it down. You have to have more of a spotlight rather than a lamp to actually get someone to learn something well.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, I would. And the other thing that I would like to see is more of a conversation around the factors that are actually preventing some children from succeeding at school. They're often, the children who come to school perhaps disadvantaged, if you like, there's a disproportionate number who are Māori or Pacific, but the idea that if we simply teach in this way, or if we include this cultural knowledge, or if we recognise this linguistic background or whatever, therefore will improve things for those children. To me, we're not being particular enough. We're not going deep enough into what's really going on. Because my first question to that, of course, is, well, why do most Māori or Pacific children actually do very well? There's more of a spread between the children within the group than there is between the groups. So what else?
Just explain that.
So what I mean is that if we take the spectrum of Māori achievement, there'll be some who do very well, some who, across the whole spectrum, right? Same for Pākehā children, Chinese and so on. But we never compare the spread of success or achievement rates within Māori children. We only ever compare between groups and say, well, there's this disproportionate number here or whatever. Yeah. But, a fly in the ointment really of the kind of culturally responsive, culturally relative argument for education is that, well, how is it that most Māori children do very well, or a good proportion do very well, if the reason that you're saying the children who don't do well is for this, because they're all sort of in the same schools, well, same system, if you like. So I would like to see more honest and courageous conversations around what's really going on for the children. Is it family values and attitudes? Is it attendance? Is it behavioural issues? Absolutely.
And socioeconomic.
Yes.
Because I was going to say that surely it's less cultural than social or ethnic than actually your socioeconomic position.
Yes, absolutely. I think that would be a huge factor, and not until we are prepared to have those conversations and possibly sit with some uncomfortable aspects of them, we simply can't put into place any solutions that are actually going to make a meaningful difference for these children. If the issue is attendance, it doesn't matter what greetings the teacher uses on when they arrive at school if they're not arriving to school. If the issue is a hearing issue or an oral language delay, it doesn't matter what colour or cultural motifs are on the books or anything if they can't hear the book being read. So I think we just need to dive deeper and be prepared to, perhaps face some things that we maybe don't like hearing. But until we're prepared to do that, we're just not going to make any meaningful difference for these kids. And I think that's it's not ideal.
Okay. Well, I completely agree with you. And we should end there, but I could talk to you all day.
Likewise.
But thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure.
To help the Shape of Dialogue grow, please subscribe, like and comment and share it to all and sundry. Many thanks.